I'd like to break up my examination of this into three parts. One of them has to do with the national, international level of conflict. Another, an individual family situation. And the one I want to begin with is something actually quite similar to the Ferguson problem in my own experience. And this took place quite some time ago. In fact, I had just, Simon mentioned, I taught at Princeton, then took a position at the University of Pittsburgh. I had just taken that position teaching in the political science department. And this was the year after there had been quite a number of race riots in the United States, 1967. And the political science department at the University of Pittsburgh was, well, you know what political scientists do. They have answers to all social problems and explain why things happen. So they were explaining why it was that Pittsburgh, a northern industrial city with a large African-American population, it was the only urban population that had not had a race riot. And the explanations were, well, we have rivers, they're divided into different communities. And during the year, as this debate and explanation was going on, my mentor at that point, Martin Luther King Jr., was assassinated. And the city went up in flames. And of course, all the theories we've been evolving went up in flames with it. But the situation was much worse than Ferguson. It was one in which there was substantial loss of life, enormous loss of property. The governor called out the National Guard. There was a curfew on the city. We couldn't go out for 10 days after 4:30 in the afternoon. And the effect of that was enormous. I was a member of the church, same church which is sponsoring this lecture this afternoon. And we had on our board of directors, board of trustees of the church, one of the city councilors who felt that it would be helpful if the church could invite the city fathers, the mayor and the city council, university officials, some of the business community. We could get together and really consider some of the difficulties that had been raised by this incredibly destructive riot. And so the church decided to hold a meeting called Love Leads the Way. And to my shock, they asked me to lead it. And I say shocked because at that point, I had been involved. This was the time of Vietnam, the time of civil rights issues. I had been involved in fighting city council, the mayor in particular, but one city councilor who I thought was one of the worst racists that the country had ever produced. I had been not only fighting them mentally and actively in terms of the protests and other activities that we could generate, I had been hating them and feeling good about it. I mean, these were really nasty people doing horrible things. In fact, those things which had produced these terrible results that were the race riot. Well, here I was asked to lead a meeting, Love Leads the Way, when I had obviously not been loving. I accepted, but I realized that I needed to discover what I was doing that was wrong. And it was really difficult. I think perhaps intuitively I knew that there was something wrong in this. After all, I'd been a part of this religion, the founder of which, Mary Baker Eddy, said that as truth destroys error, so love destroys hate. The religion she founded, she described it, its heart and soul was love. How had I missed that? Somehow those were the ideas I had read over, and somehow made, this kind of separation that psychologists say we can do, and kind of avoiding cognitive dissonance. Well, I knew I had a problem. And there was a good friend who knew I had a problem with this as well. And he said, John, why don't you take the person whom you hate the most and imagine that he asked you to pray for him? Well, it was just a few seconds, really, 10 or 15, I think, before I realized that's the answer. I knew, having been trained in Christian Science, to recognize that when you pray for someone, you need mentally to see through facades. You need to see through a physical facade, the physical body, because that's not the real identity of the individual. And you need to see through what could be called a historical facade. And that is the accumulation, essentially, all of those things in the person's past that identify that person to you. You need mentally to push those two facades aside so that you're not distracted from seeing the real spiritual identity of the individual. Well, this was helpful. I knew now that I could do it. I just had to accomplish that. And it was, while I was still wrestling with this, that I realized that Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of that church, had written a little article, a little essay, 80 years before. And she begins this is a book that, it was an article published earlier, but that she put into a collection of writings called Miscellaneous Writings. And she begins the essay, which is called Love Your Enemies, with these two questions. What is thine enemy that thou shouldest love him? Is it a creature or a thing outside thine own creation? I had created my enemy? She goes on, the third sentence is also a question. She says, can you see an enemy, except you first formulate this enemy and then look upon the object of your own conception? Well, clearly that's what she was saying. And as I thought about it, I realized, yes, I was the one who was responsible for essentially defining this individual whom I chose, but there seem to be others, the landscape seemed to be full of them, whom I was hating. It was my creation through understanding the historical background, through associating that individual with a variety of city policies and university and business policies of the city, and that I was capable essentially of seeing through that facade to the real fundamental nature. This is recognizing, of course, that this individual was created by God in God's image and likeness, God being love itself. And that I could, not with my physical senses, but that I could spiritually perceive and appreciate the divine nature of that individual. Well, in a sense, that was the key. It enabled me to make substantial progress, such that by the time the meeting took place, I felt I could begin at least to love these individuals. The meeting went well. The meeting actually didn't solve anything, but there were a number of issues that came up that people began talking about. And within the next several years, a number of the projects that were essentially born during this discussion came to realization. But for me, the exciting thing was that in breaking through these facades, and especially my reaction to them as though that were their real identity, enabled me to begin to communicate with them. It turns out that individual whom I had identified as the one that I hated the most, became as an inspiration that I had, partly as a result of this meeting, to found a living institution. This was called an intercultural house, where an equal number of black, white American students came together not to integrate, because this was, I think, one of the errors of the individuals who had been dealing with racial issues up to that time, that the answer was integration, but that the cultures could recognize that there was something valid in each other and appreciate those values and learn how to talk to each other and learn that the intercultural communication that could take place could be on the basis of equality, of mutual respect. Well, at any rate, this was the basis of the idea of the house, and this individual, city councilor, became the person who helped me accomplish it. He was my staunchest defender, as a number of people indicated that this is not going to work. In fact, out of the 5 vice chancellors of the university, only one of them believed that it could. The other 4 were convinced that either the institution would be firebombed within the first 6 months of its existence, or the black students who agreed to participate would be forced by their colleagues to pull out. Well, that was almost 45 years ago. The institution is still in effect. Must be said, the first 10 years ago, every time I heard a fire engine, I was a little bit concerned. But it's still operating, and during this period of time, it has shaped, at least to some degree, individuals who've been wrestling with the issues of racism, recognizing that we live in a racist society, that we grow up learning without realizing it, racism, but that we can begin to understand it and deal with it. And in appreciating the real values across racial lines, that genuine communication can take place. I've talked a little bit about this because these are all aspects of feeding the good wolf, of appreciating essentially the power of divine love in our culture, in our own individual lives. But there's an element that I haven't mentioned that is just absolutely fundamental. It was an element that Jesus recognized as fundamental as well. The disciples were at least skeptical. I think they realized how difficult it was. Peter, for example, felt that, well, it's kind of probably impossible, but if I make 7 efforts in that direction, that's probably enough. You remember what I'm talking about? Where Jesus says no, not 7 times, but what is that quality? Forgiveness. That's it. Forgiveness is that which is absolutely essential. And it wasn't that Jesus said, until 70 times 7. It wasn't until you reach the 491st time you're off the hook. There's no way of getting off the hook. You have to reach this point of forgiveness. But how do we do it? Well, I think partly what I've described in terms of what I learned in learning to destroy essentially my hate for that individual on the city council is an answer. But I want to take a little bit more careful look at this. There's a definition that our culture gives to forgiveness. These are this is a Webster definition. To stop feeling anger, to grant pardon for remission of an offense. And then if you get into somewhat more psychological areas, it's conscious decision to release feelings of resentment, vengeance, toward a person or group, regardless of their deserving forgiveness. Now, this is all helpful. And in fact, it's so much better than the other thing, the not forgiveness, that of course it's very important. But I'd like to suggest that this is human forgiveness. And that there is something which I think we could call divine forgiveness, which goes way, way, way beyond that. And it's essentially what I've described was the nature of my experience back in 1968. Namely, recognizing that we need to break through our picture of the enemy if we're going to learn to love our enemies. If we're going to learn to love them, we need to break through not only the physical picture, the recognition that that individual is a physical entity, but also that that is a historical reality. And it's only by doing that that we're able to sense the genuine nature of that individual. That we're able to come essentially, because if you really get down to the bottom of this, I think this is not just forgiveness, it's learning to love. And learning to love those individuals who are the hated, the most difficult to love, whom we tend to hate. But if we can do that, which means discounting totally everything that our physical senses tell us about the individual, that's pushing aside the physical picture, but then also discounting that information which has come to us, which we collect and then shape into a creator and identify with a person. It's pushing all of that historical facade aside. And now we're in a position where we can begin, with our spiritual sense, to identify who that person really is. To appreciate the beauty, the godlike nature of their identity. Well, let's assume that you're driving very carefully down I-70 and suddenly someone passes you very, very rapidly and then cuts right in front of you, slams on the brakes. Your attitude may be different from mine. Mine is, stupid idiot. And then I hopefully will realize, it's not the right reaction. But should I forgive the stupid idiot? No. This is the temptation, I think, is we'll find something good about the individual and try to see that. And the answer is no, we need mentally to push aside that picture of anyone who could ever be a stupid idiot, but appreciate, again, the godlike creation of that individual, his real identity. During the second half of the 20th century, forgiveness was something very difficult to do vis-a-vis South Africa. For those of you who were not a part of the enormous effort to fight apartheid, South Africa had, in the very late 40s, adopted a set of policies, governmental policies, which essentially said that black Africans were inferior, needed to be separated in all kinds of ways from the white minority population in South Africa. This is a white population which was substantially less than 20%, and for whom this policy of apartheid became increasingly violent, important. By the 70s, the assumption was, since the rest of the world actually was moving not very rapidly, but quite consistently in the direction of recognizing more and more human rights, greater independence of populations. South Africa was moving rapidly in the opposite direction, less and less human rights, and certainly for this bulk of the population, well over 80% of the population, to the extent that they were now being put in concentration camps, treated sometimes worse than slaves. And as you can imagine, the reaction was violent, as well as to some degree reasoned, at least among a minority of the white population in the parliament. But the violence on both sides was enormous. And the obvious unwillingness of the government meant to everyone that I knew, and I spoke to an enormous number of people on this issue. In fact, the world was considering it in all kinds of ways and punishing in very minor ways the South African government. But it was clear that the only possible solution was going to be the worst revolution the world had ever known, the bloodiest that one could imagine. And at that time, I had the good fortune of knowing a number of South Africans, all of whom had spent substantial time in South African jails, and who were looking forward to a period post-revolutionary South Africa, and recognized that there was going to be a need for a new constitution, because after the revolution there would be a need to have a form of government that would distribute rights justly, and a need for somehow weaving those torn fabrics of the society back together again. And they asked me to be a part of them. I had taught constitutional law. I had been involved, obviously, in civil rights issues for quite some time. And the mental atmosphere of this group was the most wonderful you could imagine. It was one of forgiveness. It was one, each of these individuals had been sometimes tortured, certainly disciplined severely by the South African government, but were willing to look beyond that, to not be filled with resentment. There was this mental atmosphere of forgiveness. Desmond Tutu received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1984, and in his acceptance, he said that a life without forgiveness is not a life worth living. And that mental atmosphere permeated the mentality of the group that I was working with. There was it was led, in fact, by a poet, Dennis Brutus, but the mental, the sense of love was present, and we were able to talk about, I think, some of these same issues that I had learned earlier with regard to the racial riot in Pittsburgh. They were not in agreement totally with my prayerful approach, but we obviously coincided in quite a number of ways of the importance of love, the importance of loving and recognizing that the value of even those individuals whom we associated with these horrible policies needed to be included. There had to be a willingness to create a framework within which they could reintegrate in the post-revolutionary society. Well, we worked for a number of years, in fact 5 or 6, and then on February 11th actually, 1990, what for me was the greatest miracle of the 20th century took place. There was a new president of South Africa, actually further right than the F.W. de Klerk, and he pardoned Nelson Mandela, who had been in solitary confinement for a number of years, in prison for 27 years. And this started a sequence of acts of forgiveness on the part of the apartheid government, on the part of the ANC, the African National Congress, to such a degree that within 4 years, they were able to hold the most democratic elections that Africa had ever known up to that point, and in which Mandela was elected president. And it didn't stop there. One of the projections which we had suggested along with the Constitution was taken seriously by the new government, and they formed a court system. It was sketched out, at least in our plan, as a legal framework within which reconciliation could take place. This was a court system in which, if someone who had committed an act, a illegal act, and there were so many terroristic acts up to through 1990, but if they were willing to request forgiveness and to completely describe the nature of their act in the face of their victim or the victims of the family, who would accept that explanation, that they would be amnestied, that they would be pardoned. It was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it was in effect for 7 years. Desmond Tutu was the chairman of it. And PBS has a number of court scenes, and remember, this is a court, a legal set of proceedings based on forgiveness. That was the fundamental legal requirement. I'm suggesting these scenes just because to me they illustrate in such a beautiful way the power of forgiveness. This element of loving, which brought about reconciliation. Tens of thousands of individuals who came before the court and were able, through that, to not only be amnestied, but to begin the mending. And it's still going on, and it's still difficult, and South Africa still has an enormous number of problems. Not suggesting that it's finally found the solution, but the context, and especially this willingness to forgive, was the basis of avoiding the revolution and finding reconciliation for tens of thousands. Well, all of this is ways in which we can be feeding the good wolf. And I want to tell you just a little bit. I've mentioned Mary Baker Eddy at a few points. Mary Baker Eddy was an individual for whom the Sermon on the Mount, which I mentioned at the beginning of our lecture, the Sermon on the Mount was so important, so valuable, that she felt it could be the sermon every Sunday of the year. For her, as for Jesus, love was a power, was a tremendous force, a power stronger than the most powerful weapon of mass destruction. And she recognized that its use in correcting minor physical problems as well as major international problems was denigrated, was not recognized as valid. And in her work, she made breakthroughs of all kinds. The first breakthrough that she made was, in a sense, for herself. When this is right in the middle point of her life, she lived to be 90, almost 90, and this was at the age of 45. She made a breakthrough in being able to discover a dimension of Jesus' teaching which she recognized was absent from the churches that she had grown up in, and that explained how he was able to heal. That went beyond anything that was supernatural or a special divine gift. That was something that could be understood, learned, put into practice in a very practical way. And when she realized this perception, it's captured actually in just a couple statements that she makes as she describes. She's really describing the nature of man. Here it's the answer to the question, what is man? But it also gives a key to the way in which Jesus healed. She says, Jesus beheld in science, meaning from a purely spiritual perspective, Jesus beheld in science the perfect man who appeared to him where sinning mortal man appears to mortals. And then the next sentence, in this perfect man, the Savior saw God's own likeness. And this correct view of man healed the sick. Now, she uses the verb behold and saw, but she's not talking about physical seeing. She's talking about physical sensing. I'm sorry, she's talking about spiritual sensing. It's not the physical senses that we're using, but our spiritual sense that enables us to identify the real identity. And I just want to take a moment, because the exercise of this spiritual sense is really the key. It's that which enables us to do all that pushing aside that I've talked about up to this point of the physical identity, the historical identity. Now we've got to use the spiritual sense to see, to feel, to somehow discover the divine nature of the individual, the would-be enemy whom we're trying to love. Not easy. But let me just use this as a means, because I think it helps to get at this thing that we call spiritual sense. Imagine that you have just met two individuals who look, they're same age, same gender, they look almost alike. They're not twins or anything like that. They don't even know each other. But they're just very similar. And you have an opportunity to talk with them, let's say for 5 minutes. Okay, now you come away from that conversation with a sense that one of them, you're on the same wavelength. You feel that you can trust what that individual is telling you. The other individual, quite a few doubts. Not the kind of person you want to leave holding your wallet while you take a swim. You've probably not had that exact experience, but I'm sure you've had all kinds of similar experiences. Now, I've set this up so that there isn't anything that your physical senses have told you about these individuals. But you still feel there's a difference that you've sensed. It's your spiritual sense which enables you to make that distinction, to value the attitudes and the approach and the consideration of one individual, and to distrust, to some degree, the attitudes of the other. Now, that's a sense we all have, and we all use much too little. That's the sense which enables us to forgive. Because it's only through using that sense that we get to the point where we can really identify the godlike nature, as she describes Jesus beheld in science from this spiritual perspective, using a spiritual sense, the perfect man. That was the man of God's creating, who appeared to others as sinning mortals. He was able to see through the facade. We can see through the facade. And that's what Mary Baker Eddy discovered. That it was that idea that he was teaching to his disciples as the means of healing. It was using that spiritual sense to bring just sharply into focus in our own thinking the godlike nature of man. We need to do that for ourselves. We need to love ourselves. And it's using that spiritual sense that we only, by using our spiritual sense, that we can love ourselves. I mean, there's loving yourself, in the kind of selfish way, thinking I'm so great. And obviously that's not love. We love our genuine spiritual self by valuing our godlike nature. And in the same way, we can perceive and value the godlike nature of those around us, even our enemies. It was that breakthrough that this was a circumstance which, it was a difficult one where Mary Baker Eddy had an accident that with her physician felt was fatal, and she made that perception at that point, and was healed. Now she attributes the physical healing to that discovery of that dimension of healing which she'd never sensed elsewhere in her experience with the Bible or with Christianity. But she wanted to not just benefit, in a sense, from the healing, she wanted to find out about it. And so she explored further, she kind of tested this idea, healing in the process others, found that, yes, she could do it. Using her spiritual sense, she was able to heal others. But even more important for her was the fact that she could teach others how to use that spiritual sense so that they in turn could heal. And this confirmed to her that this was, of course, this is what Jesus was doing. There were what called his disciples, his students, that he was teaching how to sense spiritually, how to see with their spiritual sense, and on that basis heal. And she herself began not only the healing, but to essentially to train other individuals who, if they set up a full-time practice of that, would be called Christian Science practitioners. And then there was, because these individuals, through their healing, there was such a response that there was a need for more practitioners. And so then she began training teachers who could teach others to be practitioners. And she began sending these into different cities in the United States and in the world. And as these teachers began taking up residence in large cities, developing their own practice, their own teaching programs, there was conflict. A kind of classic conflict. Within a given city, who shall be the greatest? And the New York City is one of the areas that this was most intense. There was one individual, very charismatic, but who felt that she should kind of be even more important than the top teacher in that city, in New York City. But maybe second to Mary Baker Eddy, maybe even take over when Mary Baker Eddy wasn't there. And in the context of this conflict, it was a correspondence between Mary Baker Eddy and some of the other teachers. This is a part of a letter that Eddy sent to Laura Lathrop, who was another one of the teachers in New York City, in which she's indicating essentially the means of dealing with this conflict. In particular with Augustus Stetson, who was the charismatic leader who was trying to take over. And she says to Laura, "You have entered the straight and narrow path that leads to bliss, eternal, ever-unfolding love. Oh, press on, darling. Never look back. Love all. Overcome evil with good. Bless them that do not feel like blessing you. Oh, love everyone, and especially love your enemy, if you have one on earth." And then a little later she says, "Do good to them that know not how to do themselves good." Go to Mrs. Stetson, that other teacher in New York City, put your arms around her neck. Tell her how you feel. Oh, love even as Jesus the Christ hath loved. Well, that was, I think it captures so well the spirit of her encouragement to use that spiritual sense, to love, to see through, again, the behavior of Augustus Stetson. And it was the basis of that. There was other problems that came up as a result of Augustus Stetson, but certainly it solved the problem of Laura Lathrop. I'd like to jump ahead now about 100 years. This was 1890. 1990, there was a young woman who had discovered Christian Science in her teens, was now a mother, married for almost 20 years, and had experienced Christian Science, had healings, and felt that her marriage was a good, solid marriage, and then one day discovered that not only was her husband unfaithful, but that he had been from actually before their marriage, during that whole time. And it was a shock, such that she had a heart attack. The part of her side became paralyzed. Her arm was useless. And she had had healings in Christian Science. She knew that this was something that could be overcome through spiritual understanding, through really using that same dimension that Mary Baker Eddy had discovered of Jesus' teaching, using her spiritual sense. She called a practitioner for help, one of these individuals who is dedicated full time to helping people through prayer, and explained the problem. And the practitioner responded with, well, of course, first you need to forgive your husband and his mistress. What? Who's the victim here? We'll call her Susan. Susan just was stupefied, thanked the practitioner very much. She would take the case on her own, and that was the end. And she knew that she could be healed. She had had many healings up to that point. The contact with the mistress became worse. The harassment took place, even to the extent of contacting her eldest child. So much so that Susan at one point felt tempted to call the police, but felt no, she was going to pray about this and take care of it in Christian Science. And she worked to love herself, really, in the ways that I've described, of using her spiritual sense to identify accurately her true nature, her godlike nature. And weeks passed into months, months into almost a year, and she realized that the problem wasn't being solved. In fact, the arm had almost diminished to half of its diameter through lack of use. But it wasn't until there was a apparent indication that the paralysis was increasing almost into her cheek that she realized she was doing something wrong. And among other things, she realized that she couldn't just sense spiritually her own identity. She needed, if this was true about her, it had to be universally true. And she recognized that her resentment towards her husband, which had gone on, in fact, there was one point where she was even tempted to kind of blame him for this whole thing, but had refrained from doing that. But she recognized above all that she couldn't be consistent in, on the one hand, loving herself, and on the other, condemning her picture of man as, in particular, her husband and his mistress. And so she felt she had to start over. And the end of that letter that I read to Laura Lathrop kind of characterizes what she felt at this point. There was the love all, overcome evil with good, and she ends, Mary Baker Eddy ends that letter, "Oh, I thank my Father for your new birth." And that was exactly what Susan felt she needed, was a new birth. And so she began from the perspective of recognizing the universal law, that if she was to love herself as God's image and likeness, she had to sense spiritually the real identity of her husband, the real identity of his mistress, no matter what she was doing. And it was at that point that the healing began. And within a few weeks, the healing was complete. The arm had regained its strength, was free, the paralysis totally gone. She's now, this is over 20 years ago, quite an athlete. And all of this was on the basis of essentially learning what true forgiveness is. And that this use of our spiritual sense can't be restricted to ourselves as individuals or even to specific other individuals. it has to be universal. This is the way we feed the good wolf. And it's the way we break out of this idea that there have to be this vicious cycle of violence, need for revenge, greater violence, and so forth, and in which we can produce a virtuous cycle of love building on love. And in the process, we ourselves, because of our mental transformation, have been able to arrive at an ability to sense spiritually, an ability to heal. And this, of course, is learning to love. Not just learning to forgive, but actually learning to love in the way that Jesus was loving. Now, I would like to have a question-answer period for anyone who would like to stay, but I know some of you may have some other obligations this afternoon. So for those of you who want to leave, that's fine. There's one thing that I do want to share with you before you leave, and this largely because I have recognized that in these kinds of talks, there's elements that we feel, that's a good idea. That's really something I need to consciously put into practice, and I'm going to do that. This weekend is kind of full, but next weekend I'll really be able to focus. There's that other obligation, at least before Thanksgiving. And so what I'd like to do is to give you a challenge that I hope you'll take, that I would like you to, if you take the challenge, to begin working on by this evening. Maybe even before you get home. I know it's politically incorrect to talk about hating people, and we usually don't want to identify ourselves. So what I'd like you to do is to take that person whom you love the least. We all have them, even those of us who have wonderfully spiritually oriented thoughts in other directions. There are those individuals that come to thought as at least fulfilling that description of the one I love the least, and forgive them. Come to the point. Now, in this process, remember there's two things I think you need to be very alert to. Forgiving is not seeing the good things about that human being. That's good. I mean, I don't want to discourage you from doing that, but that's not spiritual forgiveness. Forgiving is pushing aside the physical picture, pushing aside the historical picture to such a degree that you can genuinely sense the spiritual identity of that individual. And it's only when those two facades have been pushed aside, or which you're, another aspect of the metaphor, you've actually seen through it, that you're at a point where you've genuinely forgiven. Now, the other element is does not imply that we're working irrespective of justice. In the Ferguson case, for example, as I've heard descriptions of individuals and behaviors and so forth, I've tried to put into practice what I've said without in any way preconceiving what the expected result should be. I haven't outlined, therefore this individual is going to be indicted or convicted or blamed or and so forth. That's a totally different question. Justice is something that is not always attainable within the human realm, but which is a separate sphere. What I'm talking about here is what we're doing in our thinking. And even though, Hitler had that wonderful dog Blondie that he loved, Stalin is supposed to have loved the ballet. These are I think I've heard often, yes, of course, I can sort of hold on to this element. That has nothing to do with genuine forgiveness. It's only as we eliminate totally from our thought those false pictures of the physical and the historical that we can begin the real process of forgiveness. So try to do that, and meanwhile, thanks so much for your kind attention this afternoon.